Hello everyone, nice of you to be joining us. Please let me know in the chat if you can hear me. Yeah, now the camera is also working and nice. Good, so we'll give people another minute to log in before we start our session today. Please use the chat freely, introduce yourself, tell us where you're from. We are really excited to start the session in a few minutes. We'll start in a few moments, 30 seconds, 1 minute. So people who want to join us and join in right now can do it in time. Okay, so we are 1 minute into the session. So let me again welcome you and start the session already. During that, I know that more people are joining us, but we will start because we have so much to cover. So I welcome you to today's webinar by Qualistory. My name is Jan and I will be your moderator for this session. And during the Q&A, we'll have also a guest speaker, Adam, one of the founders of UPRI, joining us as well. So today's talk is titled Intro to the Temperature Mapping, How to Determine Sensor Location Amount. And I do think that you will learn a lot today from this session. And this webinar will teach you what temperature mapping is and why it's important. Additionally, you will learn how to determine the number of sensors for the mapping. Please be aware that this event is recorded and the link to the recording will be sent to you within several days. And please use the chat box to your right freely to discuss the topic with your peers as the webinar progresses. And if you have a question, make sure that you click the question mark button, and if it's relevant, also mention the relevant slide. And please send a message also in the chat to the moderators and to me also directly if you have any issues during the session. And if you have any technical issues, first please refresh your window or try another device. It usually helps. So this webinar will be around 90 minutes, and we will also have a Q&A session at the end where Adam from UPRI will be the moderator. And if you stay until the end of the session, you will receive a free certificate of attendance sponsored by our event partner, UPRI. So the certificate will be sent to you probably next week, and please give it up to 7 days to be sent to you before sending us questions and inquiring. At Codehistory, we aim to provide pharma professionals with worldwide freely accessible education and industry insights, and we managed to do it with the help of our incredible partners. So for this webinar, our sponsor and partner is UPRI, and I want to thank them for supporting this event. So if you have never heard of UPRI before, here is a brief overview of what they do. So UPRI takes your hand through all parts of temperature compliance, including continuous monitoring, mapping, and qualification. So UPRI solution will comply to FDA and GP requirements. Sensors is ISO 17025 accredited, calibrated, and it is easy to use and will make you ready for an audit with one click. So imagine sleeping well at night before an audit. That's really good, because we all know how stressed we are. And so I know it also as an auditor, how people get stressed when they get auditors into the warehouse and you go through the calibrations. So UPRI also assists companies all over the globe. And so they have very intuitive software and short delivery times that makes UPRI solutions very reliable. At UPRI, they know that time is all that matters when mapping was used to be done, when a mapping has to be done yesterday already. So now I'm eager to introduce to you the speaker of today's webinar, Nathan Roman. So Nathan is the Director of Validation at Genesis, and he is responsible for qualification and validation consulting services at the company. Over the last 22 years, Nathan has placed thousands of temperature sensors in hundreds of control temperature chambers, and he helps people in the health, life sciences industries to ensure compliance with current regulations when carrying out commissioning, qualification, and validation projects. So, and his passion is to help those that must perform temperature mapping, such as learning how to make temperature maps and how to qualify the equipment correctly. And he does it by providing simple, proven, practical tools. So I'm really confident that you can learn much from Nathan today. So happy learning, and Nathan, please take it from here.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jan. Allow me a second to get my screen. All right. So I want to confirm, can everybody hear me okay? And
Please.
As you're confirming that, can you see my screen? I have today's agenda set up. All right, cool, good. All right, hey, everybody, welcome to today's session. This meeting today is known as our Intro to Temperature Mapping meeting. We'll be together, like Jan said, for about 90 minutes. I'd like to start by giving you an overview of today's session. I found that following a 5-step agenda provides the most efficient way for us to communicate. So with that, step 1 is going to be about me, a little bit about me, so that you know I'm not practicing on you. It's just a quick history. Step 2 is about you, so I can understand where you've been, where you are, and where you're going. Step 3 we'll go over the keys to effective temperature mapping. We'll go over some key elements that give you everything you need for a successful temperature mapping experience. Step 4, a quick guide to mapping protocols. So you can see how I put protocols together and you can literally take and start using today. Step 5 is determining sensor locations. We'll take a look at how to determine the number of sensors for a CTU. And then, of course, at the end, we'll have some Q&A. So a little about me. I'm driven by a passion to help others and bring value to their lives. Working alone or part of a team, I feel I thrive in a creative and adaptable environment that enables me to understand and execute my tasks. So my expertise lies in helping individuals and organizations implement temperature mapping studies and equipment qualifications in order to meet those regulatory requirements. As Jan mentioned, over 22 years of experience in commissioning, qualification, and validation services. I'm dedicated to providing accurate and informative guidance to those in need. My journey in this pharmaceutical validation field may not be typical, but I'm very grateful for the opportunity to make the difference in this field of ours. From the age of 18, I've worked as a computer-aided draftsman in the aggregate industry. I prepared detailed plans, drawings, and 3D renderings for the manufacture and erection of steel columns, beams, trusses, handrails, things like that used in the construction of quarry rock plant structures. My job at the time was very rewarding, and I was just kind of getting started into my profession as an AutoCAD draftsman. But my uncle, who happened to be a consultant in the pharmaceutical industry and had been for many years prior, called me up and asked if I knew how to read P&IDs. He had an opportunity to pull some additional help on a local project, and he needed someone to walk down some P&IDs. So of course I knew how to read them because I prepared detailed plans and drawings on AutoCAD every day, all day. Since I knew generally what he was looking for, I went to give him a hand on this weekend project out in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And that was my first exposure to this pharmaceutical world. Walking around the facility, holding a P&ID in one hand and a highlighter in the other, just marking up the prints. That was back in the year 2000. So P&ID markups was still done that traditional way. Performing ductwork and process piping walkdowns was my first exposure to the pharmaceutical industry. And from that point on, he brought me and my two cousins, his sons, into the industry. I left the AutoCAD world and entered the validation world. Over 2 decades of experience working hand in hand with customers and folks like yourselves. These days, I do what I do by providing simple and practical tools for compliant mapping and qualification. And today, I'd like to talk about some key elements that give you everything you need for a successful temperature mapping experience. But first, so I can understand where you've been and where you are at right now and where you're going, please take some time to check out the poll questions about you. It helps me to gauge any needs in the industry, topics that should be addressed, and ultimately it helps me to help you. So those polls are being added to the poll section of this webinar right now. I'll just give a minute of time to allow folks to check them out, to respond, and then I'll continue on.
So I will allow myself to moderate a bit the part of the poll. So the first poll where we're asking people to rate their knowledge about temperature mapping. So far 40% fall in the from 1 to 5. So 40% are located in the 3 area. 10% 1, 20% 2, 20% 4. So 40% are in the 3 area. I will close the poll and I will continue with the next one. So feel free to continue inputting the polls. So we'll launch, we have quite a lot of interesting polls this session, and they will be available for you throughout the session.
Yeah, on that first question, 5 is would be the expert on that first poll. All right, so I'll continue to get moving here. So imagine that you're a scientist working in an R&D laboratory, and your team has just developed a new drug candidate or compound that it has the potential to revolutionize treatment for a particular disease. Well, this drug compound has undergone rigorous testing and has shown promising results. And you and your team are eager to move forward with the next phase of development. However, there's one critical aspect that you cannot afford to overlook: the storage and handling of the drug compound. You know that the stability of the drug can be greatly affected by temperature, and that even a slight fluctuation in temperature can cause degradation and potentially compromise the effectiveness of that drug. This is where the importance of maintaining and monitoring temperature comes in. By ensuring that the freezer in which the drug compound is stored is properly calibrated and functioning at the optimal temperatures, you can ensure that your drug compound is preserved in the best possible conditions. This is just one of the examples of the many ways in which maintaining and monitoring temperatures is critical in our pharma industry. Whether you're working with drug compounds, vaccines, or other temperature-sensitive materials, the proper storage and handling of these materials is essential to their integrity and effectiveness. Maintaining and monitoring temperatures is a crucial aspect, and one that it should not be overlooked. And so by taking the necessary precautions in implementing proper temperature control practices, we can assure that those valuable materials we're working with are preserved and protected. Incubators, refrigerators, freezers, and other controlled temperature units are the single most qualified piece of equipment in the pharmaceutical biotech industry. This is typically an entry-level activity, often executed by inexperienced individuals who are new to the industry, or experienced individuals new to the process. And as a result, significant resources are spent correcting failures that could have proactively been addressed if proper training was given to those individuals executing the work. So this course is a training experience where we'll learn how to effectively and efficiently thermal map various types of temperature controlled units using data loggers. Upon completion of the course, you will come to know what is temperature mapping, why we temperature map, types of CTU equipment, how to generate an IOQ, types of temperature mapping equipment, and of course, the sensor location and number of sensors. The first key to successful temperature mapping, which I always emphasize, is to clearly define what temperature mapping entails. Temperature mapping is the process of collecting and analyzing temperature data from different locations within a facility or storage space or temperature controlled environment to ensure that it is operating within predetermined limits and to identify any deviations from those limits. Now, don't get me wrong, temperature mapping and qualification are not the same. Qualification is a regulatory requirement, and temperature mapping is often performed as a part of the qualification process for pharma, biotech, and med device facilities and equipment. And it's typically required by regulatory agencies such as the FDA. However, temperature mapping solely focuses on the uniformity of temperature distribution, and the qualification protocol extends beyond that. And for those of you that aim to comply with regulatory requirements, there's a continued emphasis by regulators on the need to perform temperature mapping on controlled temperature units. As a seasoned veteran in the validation industry with well over 20 years of experience now, I've gained a wealth of knowledge through training from industry consultants, previous managers, training classes, and absolutely life experiences. So through these various avenues, I've come to understand the importance of temperature mapping for meeting the requirements of EU and US regulatory authorities and industry guidelines. Temperature mapping is a crucial process for ensuring proper environmental conditions for time and temperature sensitive materials such as vaccines, products, or other samples. The end user, study director, responsible person, or equipment owner is responsible for number one, ensuring proper environmental conditions for their processes and operations. And number two, proving temperature and humidity control and providing proper maintenance of their equipment. I understand that different countries have their own regulatory agencies that oversee the pharma industry, and these agencies often have specific guidelines and regulations regarding temp mapping. However, in general, the purpose of temperature mapping is to ensure that a temperature-controlled storage space is capable of maintaining appropriate storage conditions for your pharma products. This typically involves taking a representative sample of the storage area within a storage space and measuring the temperature at those various locations within the area. The results of temperature mapping are then analyzed to determine if the controlled storage space is capable of maintaining appropriate conditions for the products being stored or transported. Ultimately, this process serves to protect the product and the patient. In addition to conducting temperature mapping, it's important for pharmaceutical companies to have proper temperature control systems in place to ensure that their products are stored and transported under appropriate conditions. This may include the use of temperature-controlled storage and temperature transportation equipment. So as well as monitoring and recording systems to ensure that their products are not exposed to temperature excursions or temperature deviations. All right, so this slide here, this is our first engagement poll. I just want to kind of gauge the audience on their requirements or guidelines that they're familiar with. So Jan will post a couple of polls over on the polls side, and go ahead and vote. Go ahead and cast your selections. But I'm going to go ahead and continue with the presentation as you guys are checking out those polls. So what do the guidelines and regulations say about temp mapping? Temp mapping is a crucial process for ensuring proper storage and transportation for pharmaceutical products in various regulatory bodies such as FDA, the USP, the CDC, the EU or European Commission, the MHRA, and the World Health Organization have specific guidelines and regulations in place for this process. According to the FDA's guidance for the industry, temperature mapping of storage and transportation conditions for drug products, temp mapping should be conducted to ensure that a facility or equipment is capable of maintaining appropriate storage conditions for their drug products. The guidance recommends conducting temperature mapping in a representative space of where the storage and transportation areas are within a facility, and that the temperature mapping should be representative of the types of drug products stored and transported in the facility. It also recommends conducting temperature mapping at the time of facility or equipment qualification and requalification, and documenting and reviewing those results to ensure that the facility or equipment can maintain appropriate storage conditions for their drug products. In addition to FDA guidance, the USP provides guidance and considerations on temp mapping and storage locations. The CDC recommends implementing clearly written, detailed, and up-to-date storage and handling standard operating procedures, and appointing a coordinator or a responsible person to oversee the proper handling and storage. And the EU or the European Commission speaks of the need for product storage segregation and ensuring adequate control of the temperature-controlled environments, taking into account seasonal variations. Even the MHRA recommends conducting temperature mapping once in the summer and once in the winter. The World Health Organization also has a lot to say about temperature-controlled storage areas and temp mapping. So we aim to comply with these different regulations and requirements. And so understanding the process and importance of temperature mapping is very essential. Why we temp map. As previously mentioned, temperature mapping is crucial for product production, transportation, and storage of those time and temperature sensitive products. In industries, not just in pharmaceutical industries, but for food and beverage and med device production. All of these industries are regulated by the government and must provide data on the environmental temperatures during production, transportation, and storage to ensure compliance. Companies must also verify that their equipment is operating correctly and that their products are safe. There are several reasons why temp mapping is important for our pharma industry. One, to ensure product stability and effectiveness. Two, to validate temperature control systems and equipment. Three, to identify infrastructure and design issues. Four, to meet regulatory requirements. So one, to ensure product stability and effectiveness, temperature excursions can potentially impact the stability and effectiveness of the product. And so by conducting temp mapping, you can identify areas within a facility or equipment that may be at risk of experiencing temperature excursions, and you can take steps to mitigate those risks. Two was to validate temperature control systems and equipment. Temperature mapping can help to validate the effectiveness of temperature control systems and equipment such as refrigerators, freezers, and temp controlled storage and transportation containers such as shipping containers or dewars. And by conducting temp mapping, you can ensure that these systems and equipment are functioning properly and are capable of maintaining the required storage and transportation conditions for these products being stored. Number 3 was to identify infrastructure and design issues. So for example, if a temperature mapping reveals that certain areas of the facility are consistently warmer or cooler than the desired storage temperature, then that reading can indicate that there are issues with the facility's heating, venting, and air conditioning HVAC systems, or with the installation of the facility. Number 4 was to meet regulatory requirements. And as previously mentioned, many regulatory bodies have specific guidelines and regulations regarding temp mapping. But by conducting temperature mapping, you can assure that your facility is in compliance with those regulations. And that brings me to the question on the screen that I'd like to address with the definition that I'm quite fond of. What is the purpose of temperature mapping? The purpose of temperature mapping is to ensure and prove that a temperature-controlled space is suitable for its intended purpose. So ensure means to make sure, certain, or safe. And prove means to establish the existence, truth, or validity as by way of evidence. So I really like this definition of the purpose of temperature mapping. The purpose of temperature mapping is to ensure and prove that a temperature-controlled space is suitable for its intended purpose. Okay, so we've touched on what temperature mapping is, a high-level view of what the regulations and guidelines say. We've addressed why we temp map and the purpose of temp mapping. Now I'd like to share a little bit about the types of equipment or CTUs that we perform temperature mapping qualifications on. So here's a list of some common temperature controlled units that we use to store our products. So we have cryogenic storage freezers, ultra low freezers, lab freezers, refrigerators, incubators, ovens, walk-in cold rooms, stability chambers, warehouses. But with all that, it's hard to say which unit on the list is the most used in the industry, but it can vary depending on how we need to use the equipment, its application, or even depends on the facility that are using the equipment. However, the ultra-low freezers and refrigerators are commonly used in the pharmaceutical and biotech industry. And by performing temp mapping for these units ensures that every point within the defined storage area confidently meets specific acceptance criteria. The temperature mapping is performed over a period of time to ensure that as the systems actuate, the temperature is always within limits and without deviation. As a representative in the pharmaceutical industry, you may be responsible for generating an installation qualification, an operational qualification, and a performance qualification for new equipment or processes, right? So these qualifications are typically required to ensure that the equipment and processes are installed, operated, and they perform correctly, and that they meet that they continue to meet the required specifications and performance criteria. Here's a general step-by-step process for generating an IOQ. First, determine the scope of the qualification. This includes identifying equipment or processes to be qualified, as well as any associated systems and utilities that will be included with the qualification. Second, develop a qualification plan. Before you can start a temperature mapping study or qualify your equipment, you must be sure to create a detailed test plan or develop a qualification plan. That plan must be based on the equipment or the process description and its intended use. The detailed plan that we're talking about is also known as the protocol. This plan should outline the specific activities and tests that will be conducted as part of the qualification, as well as the acceptance criteria that must be met in order for the qualification to be considered successful. A properly developed qualification protocol will help ensure that equipments meet all the documentation requirements and performs as expected. This includes ensuring that the temperature mapping study is carried out correctly. Okay, so this webinar today here focuses on only 3 stages of qualification that are required before release of temperature controlled area or space for routine use. Conduct the installation qualification, conducting the operational qualification, conducting the performance qualification, and then of course documenting the results of the qualification, review and approval of the qualification. So in terms of conducting the IOQ, that means to demonstrate that the process or equipment meets all specifications, that it's installed correctly, and all required components and documents needed for continued operation are installed and in place. This may include inspections, tests, and documentation review. The OQ demonstrates that all facets of the process or equipment perform as specified when operated in accordance with standard operating procedures and manufacturer recommendations, and that it confirms that the equipment is capable of meeting its intended use. This may include functional testing, performance testing, and operational testing. And the PQ will demonstrate that the process or equipment consistently performs as intended under routine operations and may include testing the equipment or process over a range of operating conditions and verifying that it meets the required performance criteria. All right, so it's important to note that the quality of the qualification depends largely on the quality of your test plan. So what does a basic qualification protocol contain? Here's a list of what a basic controlled temperature chamber qualification or temperature mapping protocol should contain. Generally, a protocol contains a documented approach to conduct the qualification process, along with a procedure, a scope, an equipment description, responsibilities, your test method or your qualification method, IQ, OQ, and PQ test scripts, the acceptance criteria of those test scripts, and then, of course, your final report and your approval process. Since some of these concepts are not entirely always clear, the ISPE Good Practice Guide for Controlled Temperature Chambers provides guidance on commissioning and qualification, temperature mapping, periodic reviews, and they also provide examples and sample templates in their guide. But for some quick guides, I'm providing in the file section of the webinar. Jan will include a file that I created that is yours for just a quick guide to generating IOQ protocols. Prior to performing a qualification or requalification on any temperature controlled unit, you'll want to ensure that you have all documentation required to meet the manufacturer's specifications and site requirements for your protocol. This document may include things like installation instructions, operating manuals, and any relevant regulatory guidelines. When all installation, operational, and performance testing has been completed, and all exceptional conditions, if any, have been documented and resolved, and all your acceptance criteria have been met, the completed IQ-OQ protocol will then be circulated for post-execution approval. And once that IOQ has been approved by all appropriate departments, the temperature mapping qualification of the CTU is considered completed. The completed qualification and mapping study certifies that the equipment is performing as per required standards during testing and may be suitable for then operation. However, it doesn't mean that it will ensure the same performance will continue thereafter. Quick question. Have any of you ever encountered a situation where you were unable to begin qualification protocol due to your equipment not being fully installed or ready? Meaning, have you gone out to the field to execute your protocol and the unit isn't set up right? If yes, then I have a quick tip for you. I recommend conducting an equipment walkdown prior to starting any documentation to ensure that all necessary supplies and materials are present and accounted for. This will not only help meet the owner's requirements, but it will also provide an opportunity to identify potential issues or areas for improvement before they become a problem or before you start the qualification. In this next section of our webinar, we'll be discussing the different types of temperature mapping equipment available. And understanding the different types of equipment available, you can choose the right one for your specific application and ensure that the best performance of your temperature controlled chambers. You will perform the temperature mapping studies by using calibrated temperature sensors or data loggers. The World Health Organization says that a mapping study contains a significant a sufficient number of, they call them electronic data logging monitors, EDLMS, in the WHO guidelines. And that's to ensure that the temperature distribution in the space is to be mapped and adequately characterized. So with this slide, Jan's going to put up a couple quick data logger polls. Just some quick questions around what type of equipment do you use for temp mapping, and how many types of data loggers do you currently use in your facility for temp mapping? Just a couple quick polls to understand where you guys are at and what you're using. I'll go ahead and keep moving. So those polls will be there. So take your time, get to them when you can. So there are a variety of temperature mapping equipment options available for use in our industry. Data loggers come in all different shapes and sizes, right? So data loggers can come with internal sensors, USB data loggers that those devices connect to a computer via USB. We have wireless data loggers, cloud-based data loggers. These devices can store data in the cloud, allowing you access from anywhere with an internet connection. Portable data loggers, designed to be small and lightweight, making them easy to carry around and be able to use and put in different locations. Data loggers cost vary from around $10 to several $1,000s. The quality differences between these loggers are substantial. I'm no expert in the data loggers sales and service, but I know that the quality and accuracy of the loggers increase with the cost of some loggers And some of them are not suitable for all mapping applications. So you always want to watch out for the different mapping applications that you have. For example, any extreme temperatures of LN2 cryo vessels, or that of an autoclave or oven requiring a specific data logger, or even the use of thermocouple application. Some other important considerations for data loggers are the accuracy of the logger. Does it contain an internal external sensor? What are the material of construction of the data logger? Can your application handle, or can the data logger handle that application? Your logging frequency, memory, calibration. Data logger should always be calibrated annually, either by an ISO 17025 calibration lab, and it should be traceable to your national standards. And another consideration is the software. Ensure that your software is 21 CFR Part 11 compliant. So what is the expected result of temp mapping? These data loggers are placed in specific predefined locations inside our chambers or our freezers, refrigerators. And the expected result of temperature mapping study is to identify areas within that space or equipment that may be at risk of experiencing temperature excursions. And it's also to determine if the space or equipment can maintain appropriate storage conditions for our products. Temperature mapping typically involves collecting temperature data from a representative sample area or a space or equipment, and those data loggers must be undisturbed for a period of time. Typically, it's 24 hours for a off-the-shelf unit. Once the testing is complete and you've collected data for the full time allotted, the data loggers are collected and the data is downloaded. The results of the temperature mapping study should be documented and reviewed to ensure that the facility or equipment is meeting the required storage or transportation conditions. And it's also to identify any areas that may need to be addressed in order to maintain those conditions. This activity shows you what is happening inside of your space, such as hot spots or cold spots, and your results will be documented, and the data can be compiled into one main report or separate reports for individual analysis of time and temperature. You'll use that data to determine whether or not your storage unit meets the specifications or requirements you set for the intended product or samples or reagents that you want to store. Or in other words, is your equipment fit for its intended use? Overall, the expected result of temperature mapping is to ensure that a space or equipment is capable of maintaining the appropriate storage conditions for your products, and to identify and address any issues that may impact those conditions. Okay, so important question here. Why did the engineer install so many temperature sensors? Because he wanted to make sure he had a temperature map that was accurate to the degree. Sorry, guys. I'm a dad, and many times over. So to me, that's funny. It's a joke. I think it's funny. You can just classify it as a dad joke, but just thought I'd throw that in there. I thought it was cute, but we can move on. Thank you. Some of you are laughing. I see some of you are probably dads. Okay, so we've touched on what temperature mapping is, why we temp map, different types of CTU considerations. We've talked about a quick IQ, OQ, PQ guide to knowing what's in a protocol. We've touched on different types of temperature mapping equipment. So now that brings us to this slide, the number one most asked temperature mapping question, right? How do you determine the number of sensors for mapping? Well, regulatory guidance does not give definitive answers to that question. How many sensors? However, there is industry guidance that's found to be acceptable by the regulatory bodies. And as an industry leading temperature mapping specialist, I can tell you that the placement of thermocouples or data loggers is an important consideration when conducting a temperature mapping study. The number of data loggers to be placed in a controlled temperature chamber is determined by a combination of factors, including the size of the chamber, which we'll cover in a minute, the volume of product being tested, the number of temperature zones inside that chamber or controlled space, and the level of precision required for the study, needing to ensure that the temperature throughout the process is within its acceptable range. So as you know, thermocouples and data loggers are used to measure and record temperature at various locations within the space, and those locations where those devices are placed can impact the accuracy and reliability of the temperature data collected. So how can the location of data loggers impact the accuracy of your data? Well, the location of data loggers is critical and can significantly impact the temperature data collected for some of the following reasons: airflow patterns, product location, temperature gradients, and interference. Airflow patterns, from the standpoint of the location of data loggers within a CTU, can affect the airflow patterns within the unit, which in turn can impact the temperature distribution. Inefficiency also happens when airflow is neglected. Placing data loggers in strategic locations can help to ensure that the temperature data collected accurately reflects the temperature conditions inside the unit. Product location. For example, placing temperature loggers close to where the product being stored can provide a more accurate representation of the temperature conditions experienced by those products. Temperature gradients. So CTUs are not always evenly temperature controlled, and the temperature gradients may exist within the unit. The location of data loggers can impact that measurement of these gradients and therefore the accuracy of your temperature data. Interference. So the location of data loggers can also impact the accuracy of the temperature data collected. If it's placed in a location that may be subject to interference from other sources, such as sunlight, electronic devices, or other heat sources. So the placement of data loggers within a CTU is important to ensure that your temperature mapping data collected is accurate, reliable, and representative of the actual temperature conditions within the unit. Let's quickly touch on the placement of thermocouples or data loggers. When it comes to number of sensors and positions for temp mapping and qualification of our CTUs, I recommend you to refer to the ISPE Good Practice Guide on Controlled Temperature Chambers. During a qualification, when you're placing thermocouples or data loggers, it's important to follow these guidelines outlined in your temperature mapping protocol. But if you're a person generating that protocol, then you'll want to know, how do you determine the number of sensors for mapping? But first, please remember, when placing thermocouples or data loggers, it's important to confirm that these devices are properly calibrated before use to ensure that your readings are accurate. For example, do you have a calibration cert in hand before you execute? it's important to ensure that these sensors are properly calibrated before use to ensure that your temperature readings are accurate. All right, so back to the question at hand. How do you determine the number of sensors for mapping? Well, industry guidance recommends that when determining mapping locations, the potential storage location should also be considered, along with some other general considerations for the placement of thermocouples or data loggers. Representative locations. The sensors should be placed at locations, as previously mentioned, that are representative of the storage and transportation areas of the equipment, taking into account factors such as the layout and design of the equipment, the types of products being stored, and the temperature requirements of those products. Another is accessibility. The sensors should be placed in locations that are easily accessible for mapping, while also minimizing the risk of interference or damage. And when placing thermocouples or data loggers, it's important to follow the guidelines outlined in accepted industry guidelines. For the typical commercial off-the-shelf controlled temperature chamber, like a freezer, a refrigerator, incubator, or environmental chamber that we consistently perform mapping studies on, it is recommended to use a minimum of 10 temperature sensors in chambers with internal volumes of up to 2 cubic meters or 70 cubic feet. And to put that into perspective for you, the typical unit size that we map on a regular basis range from 3 cubic feet to 30 cubic feet. In the picture displayed are typical double door refrigerators, single door freezers, or even a single door incubator there. Those are the typical type equipment that we will be performing mapping on, that I follow, my team follows the guidelines on how many temperature loggers to place in there. Industry guidance suggests the sensors be placed in each of the 8 corners of the chamber, and with one in the geometric center of the space. So that's 9 sensors, plus an extra one to be placed adjacent to the control or display monitoring probe. So that makes a minimum of at least 10. This approach will allow you to capture data from a variety of locations within your equipment or your temperature controlled space, including areas that may be less or more affected by external forces such as the sun exposure or drafts. Again, it's important to ensure that your sensors are properly calibrated and that multiple readings are taken at each location in order to improve the accuracy of the data you're looking for. So just to quickly recap on this, you'll need to place sensors in a uniform pattern in all 3 dimensions of your space, top to bottom, left to right, front to back. All sensors other than the one in the center should be placed away from nearest walls at a distance that will define the actual volume of the space used for storage. Don't forget to add the additional sensor that should be placed near the display, control, or monitoring probes in the unit. So for larger units, you can see on the sensor placement example guide that I have listed, you can place 5 sensors on the middle shelf, or even lay out an alternative pattern on the middle shelf. For example, 5 sensors on shelf 1. Shelf 2, you can place the sensors in the back left corner and the right front corner. Shelf 3 can place one in the middle. Shelf 4, you'd have front left and right back. And 5, you could have 5 more on the bottom. So in summary, it's important to adhere to industry guidelines when installing sensors in a chamber or other enclosed space like a cold room. But This means placing at least 10 sensors in strategic locations, including the corners in the center of the space, as well as near any display or control monitoring probes. By following these guidelines that are provided, you can ensure that you'll capture the accurate temperature data from all areas of your space, including those that are susceptible to the external factors like sun or drafts. Remember to properly calibrate, again, the sensors to make multiple readings. I talk about calibrating the sensors a lot because for those of us validation specialists or engineers that go out to the field and qualify these units, if you don't have properly calibrated sensors or your calibration dates have been missed and you're using a data logger or a device that is outside of calibration, and you don't pick up on that, you don't look at that first, and you go out and you actually start qualifying units, that brings into a lot of issues, deviations, observations, calls into a question a lot of the qualifications that you've done. So that's why I harp on remembering to check that you have calibrated sensors. Here's a step-by-step guide for how to determine sensor locations and the amount of data loggers for temperature mapping studies. 1, define the scope and objectives of the temperature mapping study. 2, identify the critical temperature zones and locations within the equipment or storage space. 3, determine the number and placement of sensors and data loggers. 4, install sensors and data loggers. 5, test and calibrate the sensors and data loggers. And 6, collect and analyze the temperature data. So with number 1, this should include the intended use of the equipment or storage space, the regulatory requirements that apply, and the specific temperature limits that must be maintained. Number 2, identifying critical temperature zones. These are the areas where temperature is most critical to the quality, safety, and efficacy of the product, where deviations from predetermined limits could have the greatest impact. Number 3, determine the number and placement of sensors. The number and placement of sensors and data loggers should be sufficient to provide comprehensive coverage of the critical temperature zones and locations, and to ensure that the temperature data collected is at an appropriate frequency and resolution. Number 4, install the sensors and data loggers. They should be installed in a manner that is consistent with manufacturer's instructions and in accordance with good engineering practices. Number 5 was test and calibrate sensors. So sensors and data loggers should be tested and calibrated to ensure that they are functioning correctly and that the data collected is accurate and reliable. And number 6, collect and analyze temperature data. Temperature data should be collected and analyzed over a sufficient period of time to ensure that the facility equipment or systems are operating consistently and within predetermined limits. Any deviation from those limits should be investigated and addressed. Okay, so I wanted to give you guys some simple tips for ensuring good temperature mapping experiences. I've also included these over in the form download section of the webinar. I believe that it's a part of the same form that was provided to you earlier. So if you wanted to check that out, you could go and download that. Number 1 was to know and understand your equipment requirements. 2, verify CTU calibration prior to execution. Third tip is to document the placement of each thermocouple or data logger on the sensor placement data sheet that's in your protocol, and sketch out any additional details. And you should do that at the time of placement. Sometimes people will go out into the field and put data loggers all throughout your unit, and then think they'll go back to the table and fill out the, where they put the data loggers. That'll bite you. Do it at the time of placement. Tip 4 was, before starting the temperature mapping study, ensure that all sample intervals are correctly programmed. For studies greater than or equal to 24 hours, 5 or 10-minute intervals are standard. And for studies less than 2 hours, 30-second intervals are recommended. Number 5 is to allow your thermocouples or data loggers and the controlled temperature chamber to reach temperature equilibrium. Once your unit is stabilized at the desired temperature and the sensors have acclimated, I would allow your sensors to collect 10 to 30 minutes of more data to allow for your appropriate data set to be collected. Sometimes people will start their sensors, put them in the unit, and start collecting right away. And after they close that door, sometimes that unit takes time to get back to temperature range or get down to temperature range. So that's the purpose of that tip. Don't forget the typical mapping durations. So CTUs that we've been talking about this morning are 24 hours, typically 24 hours. Cold rooms are typically 72 hours or 3 days. And warehouses are 7 days or 168 hours for their duration. Number 7 was label each thermocouple or data logger for identification purposes. This can be done physically with a label maker or in the applicable software, data logging software that you're using. You can usually label your sensors there. Number 8 was to keep thermocouples distance from any walls or boundaries. Number 9, the thermocouple or sensor tips should be suspended. So sometimes you're going to need to use thermocouples and you're going to need to have them suspended in the air, or you'll use a data logger which will have thermistors which will have sensors on the end, so they should be suspended. Not lying down on a surface or up against a surface or pinched between a surface, just in the air. Tip 10 was the thermocouple should be measuring in open air versus being placed in a buffer. So I know that is a controversial topic. Many different places do it many different ways. And some say the sensors should be placed in a buffer that has similar properties to that of the RTD or the EMS probes. And most of them are in a glycol buffer. Another example would be they would be in a bottle of glass beads or glycerin or in a dampening block. But the idea is to measure open air, but I know some folks, it's a topic for debate, but just thought I'd throw that in. So with that, we've discussed how temperature mapping is a critical tool. We've discussed how it ensures the stability and quality of temperature sensitive products and samples in a variety of industries, right? By implementing consistent and routine mapping practices, utilizing state-of-the-art data loggers and software, and following industry standards and regulations, you can ensure that compliance and protect yours or your customers' products and reputation. And as we've discussed today, temperature mapping can be a complex process that requires expertise and experience to perform correctly. But my hope is that you have a little better understanding of the importance of temperature mapping and the benefits that it can bring. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attending our webinar, Intro to Temperature Mapping. If you have any further questions or would like to schedule a meeting or consultation for temp mapping, feel free to give me a call, email me, contact me. I'd be happy to work with you to develop temperature mapping and qualification plans that would meet the unique needs of your business. So again, thank you for attending, and I hope that we see you in the future webinars.
Perfect. Nathan, thank you very much for this amazing presentation about the intro to temperature mapping and how to decide where to put the sensors and how many to use. And it's incredible how much we can cover in a small webinar, but we are planning with you as well more things. We have a podcast with you which will launch soon, and we are planning more webinars with you and with UPRI. So there is a limit on how much we can cover in one small session, but that's why we want to have more with you. So I will launch a poll right now, which asks you what additional topics are you interested in? And you can also let us know in the chat if those topics are not in the poll. So just let us know what really interests you and just type it in. So we have right now 20 minutes for a Q&A discussion. So I've seen that the UPRI team did an amazing job answering a lot of questions during the session, but I think we can still address many of them, or maybe collect some of the most interesting questions so everybody can hear and enjoy the answer. And for this, I would love to invite Adam Hartman, the founder at UPRI, to take the moderation of the Q&A and the discussion. And yeah, so thank you again for everybody who has come, and stay with us for this interesting Q&A and discussion. So Adam, the stage is yours as well.
Thank you very much, Jan, and to you, Nathan. It's once again been a pleasure seeing your presentation. Wow, it's just so clear to me the expertise and the abilities that you have in this field. It's been really wonderful to take us through this presentation. Thank you very much, Nathan.
Yeah, thanks you. It's hard to compact everything into a small bit of time, but you do the best you can.
I think you did a great job, at least, because you really covered so many aspects of this, because it's both like super regulated and there's so many parts that is, that's the reason why you do it. And then there's a part which is like, it's so heavily, a practical thing. There's so many things that can go wrong out there, which you really can't foresee all the time. And I assume that's a big part of your work also.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I say it a bunch of different ways, a bunch of different times, that knowing the things that it impacts and knowing the way that it can help is the reason why we do what we do. So
absolutely, and that's also when we look at all the questions that's come in during the chat here, there are a lot of it that is kind of subjected to not just the hardcore why and how you should do it, but also what happens out there that can go wrong doing a mapping, which is also something we see in UPRI a lot of time. And we asked this poll at one time, which was which of these problems has occurred to you during a thermal mapping or a temperature mapping. And funny enough, all of the above was one of the answers, and 27 answers that all of the above, and a list of things that could go wrong. So I assume it's kind of, it's normal that a lot of things does go wrong out there.
Yeah, no, it's definitely normal. And I knew that answer, all the above, was probably gonna win that poll, was because everyone has different experiences. Everyone sees and hears and feels different things. So you go out into one industry and they'll see a ton of issues with, placing thermocouples, or, and you have another fellow who, I guess it's just because we're all different, right? So we're all going to, produce, not that we're trying to produce other problems on our own. So we're going to see a ton of different problems. And the one thing I can think of is, pinching, and at least in the old days, is pinching the thermocouples in the door, or having, a wire break, or one of the data loggers malfunctions during the study, and now we don't have enough data for our 24-hour study. So yeah, the issues are widespread, but we do what we can to keep moving forward.
I think you must, because these things happen. And it's also one of the questions that come along quite often is like related to the fact that what if these things happens? What about then the test that you have just run, a loaded test taking, let's say in a warehouse 7 days or similar? Like, what about that test? How do you go on with that? Do you simply just do it all over again? Or I assume you've been in this position quite some time.
Oh yeah, quite often. And so I guess it's again, it's handled differently at all different places, but one of the ways you can address potential issues are writing that into your plan, writing that into your qualification. So if, let's say you're mapping and one of your data loggers fails, and now you don't have the correct number of data loggers to gather the data, it shouldn't just be a deviation and now you have to redo the test. There should be something worded into that qualification plan that allows for some kind of, a 10% of the data loggers are allowed to fail. It should be worked in the plan so that, you have, not a way out, but you have something to support the reason for continuing. And sometimes you do just need to redo the study, and that's nothing wrong with that. But I know it takes time and resources, but sometimes you just need to do that.
Sure. Yeah. That obviously is subjected to your definition. I got a question that is kind of related, because during your presentation you talked about the pre-calibration and working with the certificates, and it's a big part of the work, because you have X amount of data loggers in the CTU. It's around 10 to 15, and you have the surroundings also, and in a warehouse it's a lot more. So you have a lot of calibration certificates also to handle. But what about the post calibration of the equipment? Do you do it between the tests, or is it just in the end of all your tests?
Okay, so post calibration or verification of your sensors or your data loggers, it really depends, because using like your data loggers, right, or other sensors that are based on a thermistor or an RTD type of a sensor, they don't require regular post calibration or regular verifications, because it's different. It's manufactured differently. Than it's not a thermocouple, right? So thermocouples, you need to do every time you use that sensor, you need to do a post verification or calibration, because of the way it's it's manufactured. It's a thermocouple versus an RTD or a thermistor. So if I was going to map units using units like yours or similar, I would go with the recommendation that they don't need to be verified, post calibrated at the end of every unit or every test, because of the calibration around that sensor, that RTD. But if I was to be using thermocouples in a warehouse or in a cold room or in a freezer, yes, after every qualification, I would do a post verification on those thermocouples. However, if it was written into the qualification plan, if it was written into the protocol, that we're starting to group several of these units together. We'll do 3 qualifications and then a post verification of your thermocouples or data loggers, and then you move forward like that, because you want to limit yourself. Because what if you do have an out of tolerance on a thermocouple or something, and you just qualified 50 units? You call into question all your mapping. So you kind of want to probably just group them out a little bit, 3-4 units at a time, and then do a verification.
Yeah, absolutely. That seems very like a case we often see, and by the way, a super good selling point over here. Again, I'm representing UPRI obviously as the founder, a Copenhagen company, doing equipment, software, and all this compliance work. So we heavily rely on people like you, Nathan, to go out there and do the great job of being the assistant on the ground, right? Because there are so many things that just happens out there during a test or an entire qualification. Another thing, a question we got was that, when you have this huge warehouse, I know we've not touched too much about like warehouses and the mapping of those, because that's just it's just a bigger issue than the smaller CTUs basically. But a question we got, like, how do you actually do a loaded test of a warehouse? Which is fun to ask.
So that's a good question. So new warehouses, new spaces that are built, they're going to be empty. So you're going to map those empty. But then as far as a loaded warehouse, you're typically a warehouse will be loaded with the products or the storage components that are in there, and you'll map that space loaded. But as far as having to load it, or with some, typically in a fridge or a freezer, we will load with a representative load of a freezer or a refrigerator. So that could be, the boxes or the bags or freezer components. But in a warehouse, right? So where do you get big pallets of something to represent the load? You're not going to, right? So I guess in my situation, it would be the way you write that protocol out. You would, it's going to be an empty warehouse study, and when you are going to provide a loaded study, then you'll document that it's a loaded study. But for a large 4,000, to 100,000 square foot warehouse, you're not going to just be able to create a representative load to do a loaded study.
That makes perfect sense to me also. But could you, if you are in doubt and if it is in your qualification plan, like, would you then do a part of it loaded, just to validate that you've done the test overall, the entire warehouse, but now you're doing like it's just a minimized experiment in a part of it?
Yeah, I think that you could, but you just need to write that in your document. Talk about your qualification plan, and what size load are you going to be working with, and what does that load consist of?
Sure. Is that then the same with another question we got? Like, if you let's say that in the beginning of your presentation, you talked about this ensure and purpose, and that's all what this is about, And then you realize, after been mapping your storage area, that there are just certain areas of this location, CTU or warehouse, which really doesn't comply with your plan. Do you then need to, obviously you can start all over and fix it up, but could you also, just take that out of production, say that that's not part of the storage area we are going to use, and then clearly, indicate that this is not part of the area that we're using, and thereby the mapping, the qualification that we've just done is actually complying with our protocol?
Yeah, exactly. So I've done that before, many situations, many times. For some strange reason, if an area doesn't meet the criteria, or it can't or it won't, you can do that. a procedural thing. It's not just, we kind of taped off that shelf or that space in the unit or in the space, but procedurally we'll document in the protocol for one, but also in the SOP for that unit, so that users, lab users, or whomever know, because they've been trained on all the SOPs, they know that area is not to be used for storage.
Got it. And what about the another thing you mentioned is that equipment that drift. You can't always be sure after you've done a mapping that you can now just trust this equipment forever and ever. And that's probably also why you do the validations once in a while. But have you any example of equipment that you just you could feel that this one is just gonna drift, or could you give some sort of indicators what that could be? Is it the surroundings, or is it just you can't really foresee anything like that?
No, you can foresee it. So that's a really good question, because just several weeks ago, our team had experienced that. So when we do a temperature mapping on a new unit or a legacy unit, you can see where the temperature range is on your graph. You can see that maybe you're running low, you're running cold, or you're running hot, depending on what type of unit you're working with. But you can gauge that, and you can see. And lots of times, if we are running cold on a refrigerator, for example, and we're all down by the 2 and 3 degrees mark on the graph, we know, okay, this thing is running cold. It's got a set point of 5. It's running 2 or 3 degrees as the average. And we know the unit, is 10 years old, 15 years old, what have you. That something needs to be done. You need to call the manufacturer to make some adjustments here. Maybe it needs a recalibration. Different things that it may need. Sometimes it just needs to be replaced, right? Because it is old. But using that temperature mapping is your indicator to see, that drift on that unit. Time after time, you'll see that temperature is getting, closer and closer to the outside ranges. So you definitely want to use that as your indicator, and that's exactly what we did by seeing that the operating range was so low, or the actual range was so low compared to where the set point was. And so we had, you got to call in some folks to get some things fixed and adjusted. We remap, and if that the inside control range is still not doing what is expected, then you need to potentially replace that unit.
Yeah, that's really good answer to it. And isn't it really, the sole reason why you almost do temperature mappings is to really, catch that bad situation, bad storage situation where you can just see this is just not gonna work, guys. You need to replace it.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why you are to do it, so you can catch those things.
That's great. And thank you again, everyone out there, because you've really been putting out a lot of cool questions that we could moderate this Q&A session from. So I'm super sad if I can't make it all within this time.
I can't really see them, because if I look at them, I start getting distracted, and then I miss what you say, and I'm looking.
Yeah, that's how it is. And normally we would have been on a stage, Nathan, but in reality, we're just an ocean from each other right now. So just a small pond. Yeah, I would have given you a bottle of wine and said, like, thanks a lot. It's been great. And maybe one of the last ones I just want to put ahead to you is, now we've done the mapping. It's over. We succeeded. What about placing the monitoring equipment? The 1, 2, 3. How many, and how do you decide that?
Yeah, so I guess that could be a different session, different webinar. But as far as where you place the monitoring sensor, I believe that it depends on what you're mapping. Refrigerators, freezers, incubators, different than a cold room or different than a warehouse, right? So typically, you're not going to have 2 and 3 different monitoring sensors inside of a refrigerator, like those examples I showed up on the screen. you have one, right? And in a warehouse or a cold room or a walk-in, you'll have your different sensors based upon, based upon your data that you ran, based upon a risk assessment that takes into account what you're storing, the requirements of temperature sensitivity of your samples and product. So you'll run that risk assessment, and you'll be able to determine how many based on that, and where the best spots should be put based on your temperature mapping data.
Thanks. That was a great answer, Nathan. And now I think we are at the end of this webinar, and that might be a cliffhanger for our next one that could be about the monitoring equipment afterwards. And then again, I really want to thank you out there. Maybe check out UPRI's site for temperature mapping equipment. I think we can help you with both software and ISO 17025 calibrations that are something that Nathan really touched upon today, plus some interesting equipment. Jan, are you out there to help us get through this end?
Yes, I'm here. So thank you very much for this amazing session. I think I'm stuck there. I'll turn off my video, but you can hear me, right?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, perfect. I'll just stay behind. So thank you very much for this amazing session. So I will open a thread in LinkedIn to discuss it further. So if your question was not answered, please go to my LinkedIn profile and check the post about this webinar. So if we didn't manage to ask this question, ask it in this thread in LinkedIn, and Nathan could answer it there as well. Maybe even the UPRI's team will do it. On top of the chat, you see my LinkedIn profile, which you can follow me there and the posts. And you can see also the link for the next episode, let's say, the next webinar on the topic of thermal validation, things that can go wrong during the thermal validation, how to avoid. So please go also to this link and register and join us for this next session. And I really hope that we see you again, and more of such a session with Nathan and UPRI. So again, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Adam, for doing this with us. Thank you very much, and have a great day and evening to the people worldwide.
Thank you, Jan. And I think you out there, you can expect an email with the webinar recording, right, Jan? And a certificate afterwards also.
Exactly, right. So please expect the certificate and the slides within several days. Hopefully, so it can take, it depends on, we have a lot to send, so it depends also on our teams and UPRI. So maybe within a week or so, you should probably get it. Okay, and so we will start sending certificates maybe Friday, maybe Monday, and then the recording, we will polish it, make it smoother, and then we will share it with you.
Perfect.
Thank you, Nathan. It's been a pleasure to host this with you. I'm really looking forward to the next one. And yeah, cheers to you, Jan. See you next time.
Cheers to all. Goodbye.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Bye.